unremarkable, uninspired, a shrug, blasé, unimpressive, run of the mill? What if you had just given the performance of a lifetime, let's say on Broadway, or you had just had a work of art that you had worked on for months, or maybe years, and that is what the critics had written about something you had done? What if you had been on a committee at your child's school or at church, or you had met your husband's boss and his wife, and you overheard them describe you this way? These aren't mean words. These aren't angry words. These are just words of indifference. But these are cutting words. These are words that would rip you and hurt you right at your core. These are words of indifference. Would you agree with me that words of indifference feel worse than knowing that someone just flat out doesn't like you? It's been said that words of indifference are even worse than hate. They're simple words of indifference. Mediocre, mediocrity, unimportant. But they're worse than hate. Indifference summarizes what Jesus thought in the parable in Luke 10:25 with the Good Samaritan, when he's talking about when he rebukes those who fold their arms in complacency and have an attitude of sarcasm and an ask me if I care attitude. When we grow indifferent to God's will, when we grow indifferent to God's word, when we grow indifferent to God's people, something happens in our heart. When we're saved, we have this shield around our heart, the protection of the Holy Spirit. But when we begin to grow indifferent to what God has done in our heart, that indifference causes, like that wall of protection, it causes little holes in the mortar. It begins to chip away at that mortar. And those chips become cracks. And those cracks become holes. And those holes become gaps. And those gaps become gaping wounds that give the enemy full-on access to our lives. Indifference. It's a simple word, but it's a huge emotion. My husband and I got to spend a little bit of time in Europe last year, right after Bible study got out, and we quickly became indifferent to the street signs in Europe. My husband, we've been married 30 years. He married much younger, just to be clear. And he ordered a car, his dream car, if you will. He ordered a car here in the United States, and we picked it up in Europe and drove it around Europe, all over the country for 3 weeks. And we had a navigation in the car so we could drive around and know where we were going in theory. And this was some of the street signs that we encountered. So the one up on the top left, as you see here, it's hard to see, but see how that top word is crossed out with red tape? We were supposed to take that exit. That exit no longer existed, nor did that road. Don't know what happened to it, but it had red tape on it. Down below Not really sure what the red means around things, but it means the end of something. The 100, that meant the end of a 100-kilometer limit, 100 like a mile an hour but kilometer an hour limit, which then meant it was unlimited. So that's a lot of fun in a new car. You hear, you're driving along going 100 on your speedometer thing, and all of a sudden you hear go past you. So that was the end of that. So that was really reassuring. But my absolute favorite was this one here on the right. The triangle with the exclamation point. Now I use a lot, I'm an exclamation point girl. I use exclamation points in my texts. If you get text from me, I say, hey, exclamation point, how are you? Exclamation point, exclamation point. So seeing hundreds of those everywhere, I became indifferent to those because that's just how I speak. But we never did know what those meant. The triangle with the bumps, no idea what those meant. Those were everywhere. Sometimes that triangle was this way, so we don't know if it meant bumps in the road, curves in the road, rocks in the road, we weren't sure. But this sign was one that we saw often. We had not ever seen the one in the middle of it with the car that looks like it's doing something bad, like going off of the road, with an exclamation point and the bumps underneath it. But this next picture now, my husband has gotten out of the car. If you could see his face a little closer, it's a face of, I am going to solve all of Europe's road problems and figure out exactly what's going on here. He was feeling a little indifferent, but he was also feeling a little bit concerned because his new car could be affected by his indifference on this road. And he was wondering, okay, do I pay attention to this street sign or do I continue to show indifference? What I have forgotten to tell you is this road has a Y. So we've come to a Y, a fork in the road, if you will. This way was pure gravel with his new car. This way had the exclamation point, the freaky sign that shows the car going off of the road, the bumps, and right in the middle of the fork was a bucket, like a Home Depot bucket, with sticks in it and black tape around it and a handwritten sign in Czech that we have no idea what it said. And we both get our little translator, thing out, have no idea what that said. So my husband gets out of the car, I'm laughing my pants off, and I stand up, we were in a convertible, so I stand up and I'm laughing, but what are you doing? I don't know, I just have to figure out if I care what the sign says. I said, well, we have two choices, honey. We can go that way, or we can go on this gravel road. I know, I'm just trying to decide. Honey, what are you trying to decide? I don't know, I'm just trying to make a decision. Now, usually, my husband is not a man of indifference. But at this very moment, he knew that if he continued to show indifference towards the street sign, something that he cared deeply about could be affected. I tell you this story because I have the privilege today of talking to you about a man that really showed no indifference to anything he did. That man is Nehemiah. He was the epitome of anti-indifference. Nehemiah was just an ordinary guy, taken out of obscurity. But he was put into God's hands. And when someone, an ordinary guy, is put into God's hands, and when God's hands are in the plan, he'll match the plans with the abilities in ways that would be impossible without him. We're about to see this regular guy do the impossible. So what was the big deal with this man named Nehemiah? Like Joy told us last week, Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king. But Nehemiah couldn't have been a man of indifference. Nehemiah had already done many impossible things for just an ordinary man. To be the cupbearer to the king, he already would have had to have done many impossible things. He would have been chosen from a staff of thousands of people to be the cupbearer. He was just a regular guy. We know that Nehemiah wasn't royalty. He wasn't like Ezra. He wasn't a scribe. He wasn't a priest. He was just from regular lineage. But yet, he was chosen to be the king's cupbearer. Like Joy told us, he was the first to taste the wine and the food. With that, there came risk. Like Joy said, he could have been poisoned. But he was also the king's front man. At all social functions, Nehemiah would have been the guy that would have gone first. He was probably very handsome because the king would have wanted someone to represent well. So Nehemiah would have been chosen for his good looks. He would have had probably charming social graces because, again, Nehemiah, the king would have, King Artaxerxes would have wanted to be represented nicely. Nehemiah had to have lived, he had to have had relationships. We don't hear about him in the Bible, but history would tell us that he had to have had life before working for the king. So he had to have life experience. He had to have relationships before he was working for the king. But he was just a regular guy. God had spent a lot of time preparing Nehemiah before he worked for the king. Protecting Nehemiah, if you will. Setting up things in Nehemiah's life for that very moment in time for him to be in the king's life. To be the king's BFF, if you will. He hung out with the king and his wife, had all of his meals with the king and his wife. I'm not sure if there was more than one cupbearer to a king or not. I can't tell you that. But he spent a great deal of time with that king. And so God would have had to have prepared a lot of situations in Nehemiah's life to prepare him for that very moment, at that very time, for those situations to come in, for Nehemiah to be ready for what was to come next. In the opening chapter of Nehemiah, we're going to see that he had a deep relationship with God. Unknown to Nehemiah, he's about to join the ranks of the champions of faith. And in the centuries to follow, we're going to see that his name would be included with heroes like Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Esther, David. But what I want you to take from this is one simple, ordinary person can make a difference. Situations that are going on in your life can make a difference. Barbara, what's going on in your life? It can make a difference. Marianne, situations that are going on in your life right now can make a difference tomorrow. Julie, what happens in your life today can make a difference tomorrow. We have no idea what goes on in our lives today, that God's preparing us today for something that's going to happen tomorrow. Joy so graciously gave me credit for 5 years ago meeting with her to lead this women's Bible study today. Who knew that that's what God was going to prepare us for then, for now? And who knew what's going to happen today, what that will lead to tomorrow? Did Nehemiah know when he was 12 years old and he helped his buddy get his bike back from somebody that he was someday going to be leading a band of men to rebuild that wall? I have no idea. The Bible doesn't tell us that. But we don't have any idea what God is going to do with one of our lives. And so we can never take for granted that one life is going to make a difference. Nehemiah teaches us how God works in and through his people to accomplish his purposes for his glory. Don't discount for 1 second the significance of what God's going to do through you. He uses imperfect men and women to accomplish his purposes. Don't we always think that there's somebody else way better to do the job? I look in the mirror every single day and think there's someone way better to do this, to do that. But that's not what God thinks. God prepared you for your job.